Welcome everyone to the 10th episode of the Modern Brewer podcast with me, your host, Chris Lewington. I'm pretty stoked I've managed to make it to 10 episodes. The journey this show and me have been on has been pretty fun. I mean, there's definitely been some dramas along the way, spending 6 hours on YouTube trying to learn how to edit and echo out the CIP podcast audio, having to record the second part of an episode under two duvets as builders decided to start drilling holes the other side of the wall 50 minutes into a recording. And of course, the first episode I had to edit and listen to my own voice back for the first time in full. An experience I hope no one ever has to go through. Literally having my head in my hands, wondering how I have friends, how my family put up with my voice for so long. But it's also been so fun speaking with old school friends like Tristan in episode 5, giving a platform to legends like Belinda in episode 2 to showcase our outstanding knowledge. But also, what I find most fun is going to brewing events, meeting someone, or listening to their talk and thinking, this is great information everyone needs to know. I love this. And that's exactly where I found my next guest, Josh Summers. He used to be the Chief Commercial Officer for Voltaire, the CAPDI water treatment system I've seen used in breweries across the UK as a reverse osmosis alternative. I know what some of you may be thinking. Here we go, another episode of a podcast that turns into a sales pitch for the guest. But the way Josh impartially educated the listeners at his talk at the Murphy & Son events I attended, I knew he would make a great podcast guest. So today we're going to talk to you about your options to treat incoming water into the brewery and their pros and cons. I will note, if you currently are treating incoming water, this podcast will be equally useful for you, as Josh will cover some common mistakes made and just basically give you a much better understanding of what you're treating when you're treating your incoming water. So, welcome to the show, Josh Summers.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you for the very, very kind introduction.
No problem, man. Yeah, it's great to have you on the podcast. It's definitely an episode I've been thinking about for a while, ever since we did that talk at Murphy & Sons events, which was a pretty cool event. But perhaps, I've got to meet you in person, so perhaps you can give the listeners a better understanding of who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. I'm Joshua Summers. I am born and raised in the UK. I have this degree in chemistry to get the geekiness out of the way. So that's kind of what's fed all of my interest and all of my chemical knowledge that may get dropped into this podcast. I joined a company called Voltaire, as you mentioned, straight out of university, and that's really where I learned everything that I know about water treatment. I was with that group for about 12 years, up until earlier this year, when I left, and now I'm with Membrion. But all the way through, I've worked in water treatment, and that's where I've garnered the knowledge. And then along that journey, I've had the opportunity to work with a number of brewers as well as some baristas, and that's where I've learned a lot about kind of water treatment for breweries and what works, some of what doesn't. And I love to learn, love to work with that group. Very, very knowledgeable. So it's been a great opportunity for me to learn what your teams need and do my best to try and help them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I always find in our industry, I mean, and in others as well, we covered it in the last episode of Know Your Suppliers, but the suppliers of these equipment and supplies know so much. They're very much specialists in their subject, which is really cool. Do you do a lot of talks around the country, or did you do a lot of talks around the country or elsewhere talking about water treatment?
Yeah, generally, as you say, a lot of sales pitches, but I love, based on my background in chemistry, I love to build it up. Water's a bit of a big topic, or can be a bit of a big topic and misunderstood topic. So I love to break it down into kind of its core elements, and that's what I'd like to do with you today, Chris. And then build up from there and kind of give you really a 101 on water treatment, so that you feel a little bit more empowered and knowledgeable when you want to make your decisions about what water treatment you're going to use for your brewery in this case, but coffee shop or industrial facility.
Yeah, awesome. And the presentation that I saw, I know that you've sort of changed it up, and we're going to make that available for for any of the listeners. So, as we're going through these topics, if you're looking for like sort of visual aids or maybe an understanding, I think Josh is very, very kind and is going to supply that presentation, which I'll host on the Brewer Resourceful website, and I'll link in the episode notes. So if you're interested, just click on the notes, and maybe as we go through, Josh might be able to explain. You might be able to visually see what Josh is explaining. So before we treat the water, let's discuss what aspects of water we are treating.
Absolutely. So I really want to talk about the water as it comes into your brewery. So we're talking about makeup water, not your wastewater or anything like that. And then diving into what is in your water. Water is made up of 5 main components in the way that I visualize it. So that's broken down into your total suspended solids, which would be things that are not dissolved, so they're physically present in the water in the form of particulates. You then can also have organics in the water. They would be driven by organic matter, so that might be bacteria or viruses, things like that. You could see that on a water analysis if you have one done for your brewery, which we highly recommend. That may show up as BOD or COD or TOC. So that's your organic matter content. You really want to remove that. It should be done by the municipality. So your municipal supply should be clean. They'll have used things like disinfectants to kill that organic matter, which brings us on to the third component, which would be disinfectants in your water. Generally in the UK, that's chlorine or chloramines. And then the last two that I will briefly talk about, total dissolved solids. So that's TDS, or your mineral content that's in your water. So your hardness, your alkalinity, all that's going to feed into the flavor of your beer. But you may want to control how much is there. And then the last one, this one is more on the wastewater side, would be fats, oils, and greases, which generally shouldn't be in your feed water, but you definitely need to deal with them if they are.
Yeah, that would be a nightmare. So if we're going to start with sort of total suspended solids, how would a brewery look to filter these?
So I'd say this is the easiest one to deal with. This can be handled very simply just with straight physical filtration. So that would be pushing water through a filter. They can be anything from a strainer, which would be large holes generally to remove any large particulates. Going down in the size, you could then move to multimedia filtration, which would be things like sand filtration or a different media that is packed into that filter housing to give that filtering effect. And then moving a step tighter again, you can move to cartridge filters, which I strongly recommend that you place in your brewery to kind of filter out that total suspended solids as they come in. Generally, the size of the filter is going to have to be sized for the flow rate. You really want to make sure that you take account for that. Otherwise, the filter is not going to work properly and you're not going to get a good result. Or you may be burning your filters out much faster than they should be and consequently have high replacement costs. So you definitely want to kind of read the spec on the filter, so to make sure that you understand firstly the particle size that it's filtering for, and then also the flow rate that it's specified for, along with the pressure drop as the flow goes across that filter. You want to make sure that that's well suited. Otherwise, you could be limiting the flow into your brewery or limiting the pressure, so you don't have enough pressure behind that water to get it where you need to get it. You can also see that loss of pressure as that filter blinds or as it gets clogged because it's doing its job removing those suspended solids. Highly, highly recommend that you put some pressure gauges around your filter so that you can see the pressure drop across. Again, this is kind of basic knowledge, but it's things that people forget when they're banging a filter in. So recommend having your pressure gauges either side of your filter so that you can see when there's a pressure drop and then remove and replace that filter as needed. If you don't want to do that, strongly recommend that you're checking your filter definitely every quarter. and likely replacing it on a quarterly interval as well.
I mean, if we're going, we're taking water from a UK source, how often do you expect to see total suspended solids, and where do they sort of come from?
So we generally have a pretty good water supply in the UK. Splitting it out, I guess it also you have to account for if you are getting your water from a municipal supply or whether you're on a well. If you're on a well, it's very different, and I recommend that you speak to your water treatment expert or somebody in your that's local to where you live or where you brew that has knowledge of that area, and they're going to be able to help you with any questions you have around well water. If you're on a municipal supply, generally it should be pretty good, but you can get some particulate coming into the water if there's any works or if there's any breaks in the pipe or any building around you. You can definitely see spikes in the level of TSS that's in the water. It's just really straightforward first step in your water treatment, and it's going to protect everything downstream from that, so that if you do have an incursion or do have anything go wrong with your water, then it's a kind of sacrificial first step to clean that water before it comes into your brewery.
One of the breweries I worked at, there were some works going on down the road. It blinded the filters within about 15 minutes of them starting the work. They cracked a pipe. It was an absolute mess. So I know the importance of having them. They're almost one of those things that you never really need it until you need it, if so to speak. And then when you need it, you're very glad that you have one.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's really different as well. When you're home, if there's something, you can just run the tap and flush the water through, right, until it looks clear. But if you're brewing and you're attached to that line, you may not see it. Or it may be too late when you've already filled your tank, and you've got bad water or dirty water in that tank, then it's going to kind of ruin your day. So it's an easy thing to have installed. It's just there ticking over and doing its job in the background to ensure that you make the best beer possible.
Absolutely. So that covers that. And again, the two pressure gauges is definitely is a very smart way of ensuring that you can look after your filters. Is just that pressure difference. I mean, it's pretty standard across all filters, as you said, Josh, but not everyone has one. But moving on to organics, you spoke a little bit about chlorine, etc. But for a brewery, how should they be tackling organics?
So again, it's the breakup between municipality and well. Obviously, if you're on well water, there's not going to be any chlorine dosed into that water unless you're adding it yourself. So you may have some organics in the water. If you're on municipal water, then there should be a residual free chlorine in that water to keep it sterile, to keep it clean. But it also depends where you are on the line. If you're a far or a long way away from that water treatment facility, then that free chlorine may have dropped down. It can be tested with a test kit. It's pretty simple to do, but it's always good to be aware of the fact that there could be organics in the water, and that if you're taking water from a municipal supply, there's definitely going to be a residual chlorine or chloramine in the water that's designed, that's there, or that's put there to kill that organic and to make sure that it's sterile and safe to drink. And you may need to remove that chlorine or chloramine from the water, depending on your brewing preference and what you go for in your brewery.
So can I assume that if you are far away from the treatment plant and your free chlorine is low, that the opposite would occur? So if you're close to the treatment plant, then actually your free chlorine levels will be quite high.
Absolutely, and that might be when you get that swimming pool smell from the water. That's the chlorine off-gassing, and you can also taste it in the water. I actually added a basic carbon filter, which is a really easy way to remove chlorine or chloramines from your water, and did a fun little test just earlier this year. Added a basic carbon filter under the sink, and kind of gave my wife 2 glasses of water and could see whether she could tell or which one tasted better. And generally it's that free chlorine in the water that kind of gives that swimming pooly taste that people don't like. So kind of hand up in the fact that I've been in water treatment for, say, over a decade, and yet it's been over a decade before I actually did anything on the water in our house. But it's super easy to install. And I'd also strongly recommend it because it is better for for your body and better for your health if you are kind of cleaning up or tidying up the water coming into your house, especially if you've got kids and things like that.
Yeah. Or you live in London like I do. So,
Yeah.
A question I've always had around this is, we're getting disinfected water in, and often then we're, let's say, for example, a carbon filter, maybe I'm jumping the gun with how we remove it, but then now we're no longer having that sort of barrier, that defense mechanism for the water. Is it also important to somehow clean the water after water treatment? And is that the case for all methods, or is generally that only necessary for some types of filtration?
Yeah, so if you just have your particulate filter to take out the TSS, you're not going to be removing any of that free chlorine. So your water is still sterile if there's a residual. So if you store it in a tank, it can be stored for an amount of time before it all off gases, before that free chlorine goes away. And then your water could get contaminated in some way. If you are using a carbon filter to remove that chlorine, that residual free chlorine that's there keeping the water safe, keeping it sterile, then for sure, if that water's sat for a long time, days or weeks, particularly if it's warm in the summer, then, well, you've all seen it. If you leave stagnant water, it tends to go green and start growing things. And that's kind of a key thing. The chlorine's there to kill and maintain a kill. It doesn't remove the organic matter. So there is that organic matter still in the water potentially, which is going to be a great food source for anything that gets into the water somehow. So if you are using a carbon filter, generally you want to use it as your last point of treatment. And you need to kind of be aware that you are removing all of that disinfection from the water. So if you are storing it in a tank, then make sure that you're aware of where that tank is, how warm it is, how long it's sitting there. If you shut down the brewery and go for a week's holiday, you probably want to drain that tank down. And you also may want to implement a quarterly clean or some frequency where you go in and kind of bleach or clean your tanks to make sure that they are as clean as possible and that there's not that bacteria that's hanging out in a corner that can then jump in and start growing when it gets the opportunity to.
So other than, I guess, there's chlorine that you're getting on the incoming water, how else can you disinfect water yourself?
So you can use UV, which is relatively simple, relatively cheap. And basically at UV, it blasts the water to kill anything that's in that water. It is just a straight kill though. There's no residual. Like free chlorine's going to hang out in that water and continue to act on that water, keep it sterile. Whereas UV is very much once passed, as the water flows past it, it's going to kill anything in that water, but it's not going to maintain. It's not going to have a residual. That is, unless you do something, you could put a recirculation on your tank so that it's continuously recirculating around that UV light to ensure that you're getting a continuous kill on that water and keeping the water as clean as possible. But again, it's also added maintenance. UV lights, if they get blinded or if there's any particulate in the water that can settle on those lights, then it's going to interrupt the UV light and stop it doing its job. So always with water treatment, you can't just put it in and forget about it. You always have to be maintaining it. It doesn't have to be onerous, but definitely once a month or once a quarter, you should be checking your pressures on your filters. You should be cleaning your UV lights, things like that, to make sure that it's on your SOPs or your standard operating procedures. Make sure it's in your process, that you're checking the equipment is working so that it's there when you need it. The last one that I've got on your slide, if you're looking at the slide deck, is ozone. It's pretty complicated and generally pretty expensive to implement, and also can be a little toxic. So potentially there for the very large brewers, but generally not. And then you also can just dose free chlorine yourself. If you want to, you can get dosing systems where it meters in a small amount of chlorine to give you that residual chlorine dose into the water. And that's very common if you have a well water situation.
Yeah, we used UV filter and also chlorine dioxide for water before as well. Yeah, chemical handling is a bit of a nightmare for that. But yeah, there's some really good ways of cleaning the water. How, if you are, I mean, we're probably going to cover it again later, but if you are, let's say, using water treatment, how important is it to disinfect the water yourself after filtration?
I think it very much depends on where the water is going to be and how long it's going to
Mm.
sit there. Generally, if you have a holding tank, you're fine to just pass the water straight through into that holding tank and let it sit. It's if the water's going to sit for longer than a day or two, a few days, then you should consider whether you need to do something to introduce either UV or introduce free chlorine into the water to maintain that stability and that sterile nature of the water. You also are a little bit of an advantage as a brewer because you are generally boiling the water, which is also going to kill anything in it. So it's not like you're going to drinking water where it's not going to be boiled again. But it very much depends on your brewery setup and what works for you and how long that water is going to be stagnant at any point. About putting chlorine into the water, we also need to talk about removing it. I know we talked about it kind of briefly in that last section, but again, if you have that disinfectant in the water, it can add to your taste. I am unsure how much it adds to the taste because you do tend to off-gas chlorine when you boil water. So I'd say it's a bit of a 50-50 split. I've met an awful lot of brewers who don't care about having chlorine in the water because it gases, and then a number of brewers who do care. I'm not a brewer, I'm a water treatment guy. I do like beer, but I don't really know what I'm talking about, so I think that's very much down to user choice. There's one thing that I just wanted to raise on this, which is free chlorine is very easy to remove with a straight activated carbon filter. Please check with your water supply what they are using to sterilize the water. There's been a move to chloramines, which are more stable, so it lasts in the water for longer, which is better from a health and safety or sterilization point. However, chloramines are much harder to remove. You need to use catalytic carbon to remove those, which is, as always, more expensive when it gets more complex. So definitely be aware of what your municipality is using to sterilize your water. If it's chlorine, fairly straightforward with an activated carbon filter. If it's chloramines, you will need a slightly more bougie catalytic carbon filter. There is a move to standardizing more towards that style of carbon to account for it, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And then kind of the same comments as when we were talking about the filtration side for TSS. Make sure you're sizing your carbon filter for the flow rate that you're treating. If it's undersized, you could result in a pressure loss, which is going to cause you issues. If it's oversized, you can get what's called channeling, which is basically the water only passes through part of the filter, which means that it can then exhaust that area of carbon much faster. So although you've got a really big oversized carbon filter and you think you're going to be good for years and years, it's actually only flowing through one small area of it. And definitely with carbon, you want to make sure that you're maintaining and replacing that filter at the correct interval, which I'd say is generally once a quarter. The reason for that is because that carbon is going to absorb on a lot of the organics in the water. So if it's absorbing that on, it's also that carbon filter can turn itself into a great feed source. So if you're not replacing it, if you're not cleaning it or whatever's required for the carbon filter that you have, then you can create more of a problem or more of an issue by just leaving that carbon filter in place for years without any maintenance.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating points in that. I actually did not know about the chloramines being used more regularly and being harder to get out. That's really fascinating because I'm definitely on the school of thought that if I worked in a brewery that didn't have a carbon filter, for example, that definitely had a good amount of chlorine in the gas, chlorine in the water. But it's all about where you're using it in your process, which is exactly right. If it's going into a hot water tank and then it's being used in your brewing process, in your hot side process, and not so much being used downstream, then to me, I don't see that it lasts in the beer. But if you're then using it down for any sort of rinsing or anywhere it's direct contact with the beer, then of course you would, or cold water, then you would assume that it would. But yeah, so I was on that level. But then with the chloramines, that's a really interesting point. And then also with the oversized filter, I think that's great. It's quite often for people to think, just get one slightly bigger than we need. And actually what you do is you end up making it inefficient, which is really, and also to clean them or replace them, because they become great storage for organics as well. Some really good points in there, man. Really appreciate that. I think we can now move on to probably the big topic of them all, which is total dissolved solids.
Absolutely. So this is generally where, if you've ever seen me present, I get really excited and start dancing around a lot, and I generally throw up a periodic table, which you may or may not have seen for a few years, depending on when you were in school and when you last sat in a chemistry class. But for me, it's all fed from that periodic table and all of those elements or ions that are in the water. This is where also I hold up my hand and I say I love the chemistry and I understand water. So I understand what's in the water, be it hardness coming from your calcium and magnesium, or sodium, or trace minerals, so your metals, iron, zinc, copper, things like that. Or on the anion side, you've got your alkalinity, you've got your chlorides, you've got your sulfates, things like that. But I hold up my hand and I say, don't really know how it affects the beer. And that's definitely where I get into the discussion with brewers. And I'm like, I can remove things or adjust things, but you are the maestros that can make a beautiful beer with that water recipe.
Mm. Yeah, it's a big difference, isn't it, between knowing what it is and knowing how it impacts a flavor. For the purpose of water treatment, I guess it depends on what you want to go down to. But you can always add that in later down the line. So I feel like that's something you can always manage in the brewing process.
Absolutely. And this is again where I start banging on about maintenance and measurements. Uh, if you don't measure it, if you don't get a water quality analysis, you don't know what's there. So I strongly recommend doing at least one or two water analyses across the year, because your water quality may change. Again, it depends on where your municipality is pulling from. If it's in the summer, they may be pulling from different reservoirs to in the winter, and that can change your water makeup and your water recipe. And there's fairly straightforward things you can do to kind of continuously check your water quality. I always rely on conductivity. It's very easy. You can get quite a cheap conductivity probe. And if you measure that conductivity and it's just a bulk measurement of everything that's in the water, but if that's fairly stable, chances are your water quality is fairly stable. If you see a change in conductivity, it's a really easy reminder to go and maybe do a bit of a deeper dive and find out what's caused that change. Have they changed supply and your hardness is now twice what it was, or your alkalinity is totally different, which is going to affect your pH. I'm not going to say in the mash because I don't know, is that where you need to monitor the pH? See, I'm not a brewer at all. My apologies for that. But you want to, I know that it has an effect, so you want to make sure that you're understanding what your hardness is doing, what your alkalinity is doing, or what other minerals might be in that water, because it's going to affect the beer. And ideally, you want the best possible product that you can make, right?
And ultimately, as you already touched on, consistency is key with brewing across everything. So having consistent water, go back, it's impossible to have consistent beer without consistent water. So any checks you can do pre that to ensure that the water is consistent is I would say an extremely wise decision to make.
Absolutely. And again, there's simple things like a pH probe and a conductivity probe. You can get dip tests for hardness and alkalinity, which are fairly straightforward, or you can go a little bit more complex to a kind of the basic titration kits to show you what's in the water or what level of hardness is in the water, or you can go all the way up to a water quality analysis. So it's kind of as what works for you as a brewery, how big you are, how much money you have, how much time you have, and then what makes sense. But I'd strongly recommend getting a water quality analysis, at least when you first start up a brewery or change your water source or change where you're brewing, to kind of test it a couple times across the year to see if there is any variation. Shall we dive into TDS a little bit more then?
Let's go for it.
So I tend to break up the treatment or the control of TDS into three main methods, which are chemical methods, so kind of ion exchange resin or softening. You can physically control TDS, which would be reverse osmosis or nanofiltration. And then lastly, you can do it electrically, which would be kind of my background, which is membrane capacitive deionization. I think the one that people are most familiar with would be salt-based ion exchange or softening, where you're going to have a softener in your facility. As you flow water through that softener, it's going to exchange hardness ions, so calcium and magnesium, for generally sodium. And by doing that, you're going to remove the hardness, so you're going to control that scaling risk. Because you've removed the hardness, it can no longer combine with alkalinity to form scale. There's some advantages of salt-based ion exchange or softening. The advantage is it prevents scaling, reduces scaling, which makes your maintenance a lot lower in the brewery because you're not scaling up your tanks and losing efficiency. It's pretty cheap, it's pretty robust, and it's pretty conventional and commoditized. I'd say the negatives of softening is that you're not really controlling the water, you're just exchanging hardness salts or hardness ions for sodium ions. So you're still going to have a water that's relatively high in TDS, and it's going to be high in sodium, but it's going to be low in calcium and magnesium. And they're some of your key flavor carriers for brewing and for coffee that you definitely want in the water. So it can create quite an unbalanced water that may not be what you want to brew with. Of course, you can balance it with salt addition, or you could blend to put some hardness back into the water, but you definitely want to understand that it's very much just a hammer that's going to remove all the hardness and kick up your sodium content. It's not going to touch anything on the anion side, so it's not going to affect your alkalinity. To get, again, to hammer that maintenance point, you do have to have the brine to regenerate your softener. So you'll generally have that reservoir or that tank filled with the salt tablets that softener is going to pull that brine over the resin bed to regenerate it, kick off all that hardness, replace it with the sodium ions, and then allow you to soften water again. As with any water treatment, banging on about maintenance, if you don't have salt in the tank, the system's not going to regenerate, and fundamentally your softener is not going to do anything. So unfortunately, although a softener is a fairly low maintenance type of water treatment, you always have to maintain it, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people probably do the least of quite often in brewing is they buy equipment and then don't probably look after it the way it should be intended. Wait for it to go wrong and then call someone and be like, hey, this isn't working anymore. I've certainly done that. Yeah, certainly done that myself before.
For sure. Moving on to reverse osmosis. So on that list of chemical and physical, this would very much be a physical method of controlling TDS. So with an RO system, essentially what you're doing is you're forcing the water through a very, very fine sieve or membrane, so it's going to reject all of, or 99-ish% of the TDS, and you're going to get a very pure, very clean water on the other side. So some advantages of reverse osmosis: it's going to remove everything, which is fantastic, and that's going to give you a very clean zero base that you can brew from. You then need to use salt addition or blending to add some flavor or add some mineral content back to that zero base. It removes all of your solids. It also removes organics, viruses, and bacteria. So it's going to give you a very clean, crisp water, which is a good feedstock. It's fairly competitive on capital cost, and it's also fairly conventional and fairly commoditized technology, so it's relatively easy for you to get hold of. One of the disadvantages, or a few disadvantages, it is removing everything. So you will need to do that blending or that salt addition to get some flavor, get some mineral content back into your water. It can have quite high operational and maintenance costs. One of the biggest issues I'd say with an RO system is generally people will buy it, not necessarily understand it, and they can be quite finicky to maintain. So if you don't have somebody that is maintaining it, then you really need to kind of understand how it's been set up, understand how to maintain it, because otherwise it's going to break and you're going to have to start replacing membranes, which can become quite costly. An issue with RO is that typically the water recovery can be quite low, so you're wasting a lot of the water that you're bringing in, which can increase your water costs. Definitely something that's becoming more of a thing now. And it can also be quite energy intensive because you can be running quite high pressure pumps, which require electricity, which also has a cost. With reverse osmosis, I'd say operating one properly is key to how you've got it put together and how it's set up in its treatment train. Because RO is going to remove everything, then you need to look after those membranes. So you can add a softener before it, which is going to remove all the hardness. That's going to remove the scaling potential from the water, which will allow you to increase the recovery of your RO system so that it's running much more efficiently and wasting much less water. And it's also going to be a lot easier to operate the RO system because it's not needing to do the work of removing those hardness ions. Another thing that's key with reverse osmosis is the membranes are generally not tolerant to free chlorine, so you'll definitely need to have a carbon filter before you're running water into your RO system. If you don't, that chlorine's basically going to attack and melt your membranes and you're going to have to replace them. So when you're considering buying an RO system, you definitely want to ensure that you've got your TSS, your pre-filtration in place to remove any of those kind of sticks and bricks. You're going to want to make sure that you've got carbon filtration there to remove any free chlorine, to get the water as good as possible. And then you may want to consider having a softener in place. It's starting to sound a bit complex with all this equipment, but you're going to want to have, potentially, depending on the hardness level in your feed water, have that softener in place to remove the hardness. And then you can run the water through your RO system, which is going to remove all of that TDS and anything else that's present in that water and give you that very clean, low conductivity, high purity water, which then bouncing back, because it's not complicated enough, means that there is nothing in that water. So firstly, you need to make sure that either you use it or you find a way to maintain or don't allow things to grow in that water, so potentially either chlorine addition or a UV. And then the last point is because that water may be so clean, unless you blend some feed water into it to kind of dirty it up or add a bit of TDS, it could potentially become aggressive. So if you're running RO water through copper pipes, it's going to start leaching the copper out of that pipe, which is definitely bad because it's poisonous. So you want to make sure that you're kind of understanding what you're doing with that water. I don't realize I'm kind of sounding scary. I don't mean to sound scary. I just trying to convey you need to understand what each system does and how the advantages, but also what you need to put in place to allow that piece of equipment to do its job most efficiently. And not punting myself, but definitely if you don't know, don't be scared to ask questions. Chris, you're there as a resource. I make sure that my email address is available. Feel free to reach out and ask people. And I kind of want to allow this podcast to kind of highlight some information so that people can become empowered and a bit more knowledgeable when they are asking questions, so you can kind of push your water treatment expert a little bit more and not get sold something that you don't want or don't need.
Absolutely, I think it's so essential, and as you said, it's not as easy just buying a reverse osmosis machine and putting it in and having remove everything and just carry on. It is a complex process, especially with reverse osmosis. I do have a question. I know you said that the free chlorine will destroy your membranes, but will chloramines do the same thing?
Yes, so any oxidizer is generally going to attack that membrane and cause it to lose efficiency and lose its ability to either separate the salt from the water or cause it to kind of prevent the water from flowing through it. So any oxidizer, anything that's in the water to maintain that disinfection is generally going to attack the membrane as it would attack anything else in the water.
Yeah, well, that's definitely key to know, because if your water's got chloramine in and you've only got an old school carbon filter, then you're going to be damaging those membranes, which is, again, quite a very costly mistake to figure out down the line. Another question I had, Josh, you mentioned blending back into the water. What sort of percentage levels do you usually see? I know it's probably based on the brewery water, but is there like a minimum level that you would recommend that people would blend back of the raw water into RO water?
It becoming aggressive, anything over kind of 50 ppm is not going to be aggressive.
Okay.
So around 100 conductivity, the water is not going to be aggressive.
Great. That they're really good parameters, I think, for people to know. I'm sure a few people will be going to check that right now.
Just dropping that in, I should have said it earlier, but conductivity and TDS, generally conductivity is used as a proxy, as a measurement for TDS, but it's not an exact measurement. So to measure TDS properly, you need to kind of do it gravimetrically. So essentially weigh the amount of salt left after you've evaporated all the water. That's quite an expensive or time-consuming process, but when you send it out for a lab. So conductivity is a really cheap and easy proxy for TDS. Generally, I'd say it's about twice the TDS, or about 60% more. So if you have kind of 50 ppm, that's probably going to be about 75 to 100 microsiemens of conductivity. But it's good to understand that one's a proxy. Conductivity is super easy to measure, but it's not your TDS measurement.
Yeah, it is a really important differentiation to make. Another question I have on reverse osmosis, you talked about the high water wastage. Now, that is obviously with my current business and interest, that is very interesting to me. So, typically what is the water wastage for the incoming water? What sort of percent would that be?
So most water treatment people that you'll talk to, it depends, is generally the answer to about 95% of the questions you get asked. So it depends. It's going to depend on the hardness coming in. That's going to affect the LSI or the scaling potential in that water. And then as you remove the TDS and concentrate it up, it's going to increase its potential to scale. And then generally you're going to reduce your recovery to account for that. Generally, most RO systems will be run somewhere between 40 to 70%.
Whoa.
So you're going to be sending 60% to 30% of water down the drain.
That's mad.
If you have a softener, then that's removing that hardness, and then your limiting factor on the recovery is going to just be the brunt TDS that it has to remove. So if you're taking out the hardness, you're definitely making it a lot easier for the RO to operate, and consequently you should be able to operate it at a higher recovery or waste less water.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's definitely something that you want to dig into with the person or the group that set up your RO, to make sure that you're kind of asking questions or pushing them, because it's kind of in their interest and in a way in your interest to operate the RO system at a lower efficiency, because it's going to reduce the burden and reduce the maintenance needed to keep those membranes healthy and stable and operating well. But equally, you're going to be wasting a lot of water. So it's always a balance between how much treatment or pre-treatment are you doing that to that water to make the RO run easier or better, and how much water are you wasting and where does the cost shake out on either replacing your membranes or dealing with a higher wastage of water?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, especially, I work a lot in resourcefulness. Is kind of what my company does at the moment. And I did a calculation on what the true cost of water is, because I think people often look at what they get on their water supply, and let's say 17p a hectolitre, they can work it out at. I actually think the real cost comes in, you also got to dispose it, often you've got to treat it. So it looks about, for every hectolitre, is about 55 pence is what I calculated it costs to put down the drain. So if you think 60% on all the water that you're putting in, you're wasting 60% of water before you even get it into the brewery. It's just like how expensive that process must be for breweries without them ever really knowing it. So you speak to the people who provided it, and you're trying to reduce that water waste, because maybe it does reduce the life on your membranes, but there must be a trade-off. There must be the right economical point for your brewery, which is the water wastage at the cost of 55p a hectolitre, compared to how much it costs to replace the membranes more frequently. I think it's an interesting conversation for sure, and something I think if you have an RO machine, you should definitely be looking into. This is one of the key things when Josh originally did this presentation. I've seen the water wastage, we've calculated before, and it's high, but when you see the numbers right now and you're looking at it, it is kind of quite hard to even get your head around for me about how high these wastages are. So it's really important you focus on these, I think. And having that softener in line, there must be a payback. There is probably a very good return on investment calculation you could do on buying a water softener that would reduce your wastage of your water.
Completely agree. One comment on the softener, that whether you take it into account or not, whether you care or not, is that the softener uses brine, though, right? So then you're adding salt to that wastewater. Is that good for the environment? Do you care that you're using that salt to clean the water? It gets into that calculation. How much does that matter to you? And then going back to your first comment, I think it all gets back to what I'd like think I bang on a lot about, which is measurement and maintenance, right? If you're just looking at your water bill to find out how much water you're using in the brewery, you don't really have any granularity. You don't know where you're using. Water meters are fairly simple, they're fairly cheap. I'd stick them everywhere. So you know how much water you're using in the toilet out back, or how much water's going through your RO system, or how much water you're using to brew with, rather than just looking at that water bill and saying, oh, well, I use about that much a month. It's always, you need to kind of measure these things. And for me, that's always the first step. Once you measure it, then you can work out the best thing. But more often than not, it's the question that I ask when I'm working with people. Okay, great. So how much water do you use? And they're back calculate it from how much beer they're brewing, which I guess works. But also it's not really accounting for your efficiencies or where you're wasting that water. So for me, more measurements, more knowledge is always key to determine the best way forward.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I preach in my presentations on my website. You got to measure as the primary start to every sort of improvement, any process improvement, any reduction in wastage, anything you want to do, you got to measure first. And it doesn't always have to be time-consuming, expensive. It can be simple. Consistent is always the key. So yeah, not relying on water bills, but relying on your checking the water meters yourself, getting weekly, monthly, daily, however many measurements you want, to really build a picture of where your water's going, for example, of water. But that same process can be applied to all aspects of waste management and efficiency. I think to echo that, I think totally agree. I think it's really important. I don't know if there's anything else on RO you want to speak about, Josh. If not, maybe we can move on to I guess maybe even more of a specialist subject for you, which is the other type of way you can treat your water.
Absolutely. So I think we're done on RO, which brings us to the last way of treating water, which is electricity. There's a few ways to use electricity to treat water, EDR, EDI, things like that. Realistically, they're not so viable for breweries because of how they work and what they do. The technology that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is membrane capacitive deionization. It's a much more niche technology. At the moment, it's in the earlier stage of commercialization, so not quite so accessible, but there are a number of companies out there that are bringing the technology to market. So definitely something that I can help with, and Chris can help with guiding you towards some of those suppliers. Basically, in a nutshell, what you do is have a cell set up where you apply electricity in the water to attract those salts or those ions out of the water. And there's a few slides, if you look at the deck, that explain how it works. But in a nutshell, you're using that electricity to remove or reduce and control the TDS content. One of the coolest things about membrane capacitive deionization, or I say cool, I think it's cool, is that because you're using electricity, you can almost use it like your sound system. You can turn it up and you can turn it down. So you can increase or decrease the removal of TDS to a certain level that you want. So that tunability aspect is really nice for breweries, for coffee shops, for food and beverage applications where you want to give a targeted, consistent quality of water without the need to add salts or without the need to do a blend. From a maintenance standpoint, that's really nice, really valuable, and it cuts down on the work that you need to do as a brewer and some of the monitoring that you need to do. Some of the other advantages are because it is using electricity, you don't need to, and it's a more open flow path. It doesn't require such stringent pre-treatment requirements, so you don't need quite as tighter filter TSS filter as an RO system. And generally, it's also tolerant to free chlorine, so you don't need to remove that free chlorine before the system, which then ensures that residual is still present through the system and after, which keeps that water clean. So that's a really nice benefit. And generally, because you're not removing everything, you're able to operate at a higher water recovery than an RO style system. So economically and environmentally, a little bit of a nicer, easier system to operate than an RO system, because you don't require so much work on the pre-treatment side, you don't require so much on the post-treatment, and you can generally operate it more efficiently. Some of the disadvantages are it is a new technology, so it's not so commercial, it's not so commoditized. It's likely got a higher capital cost, although that can be offset against a lower operational cost. And then the last point, as I said, because it is an open flow channel, you're not going to remove any of your TSS, you're not going to remove organics. So if there is an organic load, you'd have to remove that either before or after the CAP-DI system. But there are definitely some advantages to this technology. As it becomes more commercialized, I think there's definitely going to be an uptake in kind of those food and beverage applications like breweries, like coffee shops. My previous company, Voltaire, were commercializing that technology. They have scaled back their operation, but hopefully will move forward in the future. And while at Voltaire, I did an awful lot of work with Murphy & Son. They were looking to bring that water treatment technology to the market, particularly in the UK and Europe, but also in the US. And the synergy that I love there with Murphy & Son is they are somewhat of a, without plugging them too much, they are a bit of a one-stop shop as a knowledge provider. They can do your water analysis, so they can give you guidance on kind of what sort of water you need or what you're looking for, salts for the salt addition, and then if they do pair with a water treatment technology provider, then maybe they can give you kind of advice on some technologies that would work for your brewery or for the application that you're aiming for. They're also a fun team and they're great to work with.
So yeah, they're great. I work with them a lot. I really like them. Again, exactly a one-stop shop of knowledge, and the amount of, I guess, resources they put into advancements in the brewing industry are outstanding. That was just so ahead of the game with that. Really cool company and just a great team of people. Couldn't agree more. I do have a question, Josh, and I'm going to call it CAP-DI just because I don't want to have to keep saying, I can't even say some of these words. So I'm going to shorten it to like the CAP-DI if that's okay. But with the CAP-DI system, how much energy or how much electricity is required to run it? Is it quite intensive or?
It's very... What's the opposite of intensive? Unintensive. Oh, dear me, I'm not very educated. Basically, the way that I like to think about it is that with an RO system, you have a large bulk of water and a very, very small impurity of salt, and you're using a lot of energy to physically remove or push that bulk of water across the membrane, leaving that small amount of impurity. So RO is inherently quite energy intensive. With a CAPDI system, because you're using a very small amount of electricity to target that small amount of salt impurity, you're selectively removing or reducing that TDS content rather than removing the bulk water. So when we did calculations, generally a CAPDI system will be about a third to half the OPEX energy consumption of an RO system. So significantly more efficient. And then on a water recovery side, generally we would run a CAPDI system between 70 to 90% recovery, again depending on your water quality, depending on your output target. So generally 10 to 20% more efficient than an RO system.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, I'm going to come to the point that between the three of them, I guess there's a cost comparison between the three. So let's say one brewery has, let's say just, we're not going to say the specific size of the brewery, but what sort of capital cost is required for, I mean, the water softener? I personally don't know if that's a totally one-stop shop viable option for a brewery. As you said, increasing that sodium concentration is definitely a problem for breweries. So maybe that one doesn't really count. But between, let's say, reverse osmosis and CAPD, what sort of capital costs are required as a difference?
It's always going to depend on the quality of water you have coming in and the quality that you want on the other side to brew your beer with, as well as the flow rate. Generally, RO is much more commoditized, so you're going to be able to go out and shop it from either a number of water treatment suppliers, or you could take a plunge and buy one off the shelf. There's a number of suppliers out there that would sell direct. Again, if you go down that route, it's kind of on you to set up. So it's always depends what you want and how you want to handle that, right? Whether you look at it more as a piece of equipment you install or something that you're going to get the service and the support with. As I said, CAPDI is being commercialized. There's a few players in the market that you can go to, and I can definitely help facilitate those conversations and make some introductions. I've dropped some links into you. So it's always going to be a conversation with those suppliers to work out what you need and what works for you, and kind of what overall treatment train you need, whether you want to have a softener, whether you want to have carbon filtration, or where you place it in that train. So it's always going to depend. It always depends on the water quality that you have coming in and what you want to do with it.
So if we were going to summarize a lot of what we said, what do you think are like the key points that you would take away from this podcast if you were listening to it?
I'm glad you asked, since I'm sat here looking at my summary slide. So on my summary slide, and thank you for leading into that, I think water treatment's pretty complicated. So don't be scared of it. It is complicated. Water is always different. It's different everywhere, and it can get complicated. And something that we haven't talked about is nuanced weird things, like if you've got a lot of iron in your water, you may need to treat that in a different way to if it's just straight hardness and other TDS. So it is complicated, which brings you to know what's in your water. Get a water quality analysis, speak to other businesses that are in your area to use their knowledge of what's in your water. Know how much you need, how much water are you using, where are you using it, and then try and understand what you want. So where are you using the water, and what quality water do you need for each application? It doesn't necessarily make sense to use RO quality water for everything in the brewery, nor does it make sense to necessarily use water that you've filtered with a carbon filter everywhere in the brewery, because you may not need it for washing, for wash down and washing the floors. You don't need the best quality water, right? Although that said, if it's high in hardness, it can leave the salt stains everywhere, which are also not very aesthetic. So understand what you want, and then speak to an expert, or ideally speak to multiple experts, so you can cross kind of confer and work out who knows what they're talking about, and get the best get the best kind of information for your application. So definitely those kind of 5 things. It's complicated. Know what is in your water, know how much you need, measure it, try and understand what you want, and then speak to an expert and measure, as you said, and as I've banged on about. If you don't measure it, you don't know.
Yeah, and I really want to echo a point that you made earlier. If anyone is listening to this thinking, oh, I need a bit more understanding or maybe some more specific support or help, I mean, reach out to me. But of course, as Josh said, it would be much smarter for you to reach out to Josh. Otherwise, all I'm going to do is redirect you to him. So, but yeah, it'd be great. Josh would always be able to help. I know he's really keen to help people out and share his knowledge and his passion on this. Josh, is there anything else you want to add to this podcast?
No, I think I'm good. It's been really enjoyable and I hope it's helpful and mirroring your comments. I love chatting to people. I love meeting people. So always feel free to ping me a message. Make sure my email address is available or over LinkedIn or however works. It's always fun to work with people and make those connections. So thank you for having me on. This has been really enjoyable.
Awesome, man. Yeah, totally appreciate it. What I'll do is I'll put your LinkedIn profile as in the notes of the podcast show, along with the presentation that you very kindly said you would share as well. So people have that resource there for them, and then your contact as well. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Josh. I appreciate it. Takes a bit of time to record these episodes, so I really do appreciate it. And yeah, keep doing awesome things, and I hope you can keep helping brewers like you. I know you helped a lot of people at Murphy & Sons event and helped myself understand more. So thank you so much, and keep being awesome, man.
Thank you. Likewise.
All right, everyone. That was an awesome episode. Really enjoyed that. One I've been wanting to get done for a while. So yeah, super stoked. This episode is going to go out, and then I will actually be on holiday. So I actually might take a week or 2 off the Modern Brewer podcast. So you might have to wait a little longer for the next episode. I will keep you updated. You can check out either on my LinkedIn or on my Instagram to keep updated on when the next episode was. Or what I strongly recommend you do is you hit the subscribe button, and then do you know what? You don't even have to worry about it. The next episode comes out, ping, comes straight on your phone, and you get to listen to it whenever you want. So that's what I recommend. That'd be awesome. Thank you so much for everyone for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode of The Modern Brewer.